Whoever is raising your hand, just you can just put your question, I guess, in the chat and we will get it sorted. We got about 20 more seconds and then we'll go ahead and get started here. All right, folks, it is 6:02. Whoever has that question in the chat, I'll come to it in a minute. Let me go ahead and get started here. So hello and welcome to this evening's Zoom webinar that's being produced by the Honors College at West Virginia University. This event is the first faculty fellow lecture taking place this fall semester. These lectures are designed to allow each Honors College Fellow an opportunity to provide an inside look into the innovative course they are currently teaching within the Honors College and will be teaching next spring semester. I am Damian Clement, Associate Dean of the Honors College here at West Virginia University. Tonight's lecture is entitled Green Worlds by Dr. Lara Farina, a professor of English in the Eberly College of Arts and Sciences. We will follow our standard Zoom webinar format this evening. After this presentation, we will host an open question and answer session. Since we are using the Zoom webinar platform for this lecture, before we begin, let me review some of the features that will help you experience this evening's lecture in the best way possible. If you have issues with audio or volume at any point during the webinar, be sure to check your personal Zoom settings and your computer volume controls. If you have questions, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Due to enhanced security protocols, webinar attendees will not be able to see other questions, only their own. To ask a question, you must click on the Q&A button. A separate screen will appear. Then you will type your question. The presenter will answer all questions live at the end of the presentation. If live captioning has been requested, it can be viewed by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen. If live captioning was not requested, a captioned version of this recording will be available at honors.wvu.edu. So now let's get started. It's my pleasure to hand over the mic and the screen to Dr. Lara Farina. So I'm going to stop the share. And now you should be able to share.
Let's see here. Whoops.
Yep.
Let's go to, let me just go to, sorry, this is backwards. I want to go up. Okay, here we go.
There you go.
Is that working, Damien?
Yes, I see it.
Okay, excellent, excellent. All right, thank you for the introduction. Hello, everybody. I can't see you because of the webinar, but I assume you're out there. As Dr. Clement just said, I am a professor in the English department. I've been at WVU since about 2002, so quite some time. And my area of specialization is medieval literature and culture. That is European and specifically British literature and culture from roughly the 5th century to the 15th. So a good long amount of time. But I also teach a course in environmental approaches to literature, in which we consider how different genres of writing enable us to talk about ecological issues or environmental issues or things, or how they prevent us from doing so. And I was actually teaching this course in environmental criticism that students told me that they would like more interdisciplinary courses sort of gave different kinds of perspectives on the sort of environmental topics and problems that we were talking about there. My research interest in particular is on historical perceptions of the natural world, how people conceived of the natural world, how they experienced it, how they use writing to sort of shape their experience of it. And specifically, I work on ideas about plants. And so that was the genesis of this course. I'm really excited to teach it since it's something been working on for a while. And this is just a great opportunity. So, oops, I'm just going to try and move myself sort of out of the way there. See if I can, oops, let me see if I can just put that down there. So the course is a course in the imagination of the natural world through a focus on plant life. So you might be asking, what are green worlds? That's something that we are going to consider. We are going to look at the history of how people have thought and perceived nature through science, art, and literature, and how that sort of shapes our understanding and our encounters with the natural world today through a focus on plant life in particular. Oops. And now I'm trying to move down. There we go. So you may be sort of wondering, well, why plants, right? I mean, why look at plants? This is something that my class and I were sort of talking about today in relationship to the first works that we were reading for the semester. And one of the things we read today was The Life of Plants by the philosopher Emmanuel Cochia. And it begins with this epigraph taken from the botanist Carl Nicholas. This is a blue planet, but it is a green world. And we might think of all the ways in which plants are not just sort of occupants of the world in which we live, but they actually take a sort of an active part in shaping it. As philosophers like Kochia and Michael Marder are at pains to point out, without plants, there's no life, right? Plants provide us with food. They provide the animals that some of us eat with food. They provide us with the air that we breathe. They have sort of shaped, they're the kind of main architects of our sort of planetary life. But as Kochia and Martyr also argue, when it comes to the kind of history of Western thought and the sort of prioritizing of knowledge, plants are often sort of pretty low on the list. They've been sort of ignored in Western philosophy and taken for granted, they argue, in many of the sort of West art forms. So thinking about this question, why look at plants? The the authors that we've surveyed for, and the sort of the folks who are working in this field that is now called critical plant studies, which is a kind of multidisciplinary approach to plant life, have offered several sort of rationales for why we need to do this. One is this sort of contention, as Kochia says, that we have neglected plant life. Two, obviously, we are at a moment of sort of environmental crisis. I don't think it's it's too edgy to sort of say that. New research into plant life and plant botany is sort of opening all these kinds of discoveries that in turn pose challenges for the ways that we've usually thought about plants. And, these folks are also arguing that we need to kind of rethink our relationship to plants for our own survival. And not only for our survival on a sort of, collective level, but for our healing on a personal level as well. So just sort of like running you through a few examples of the kinds of writings and works that are sort of inspiring our discussion in this class. I want to just sort of take us through some of the kind of reasons that I've just listed, right? That about why we need to look at plants. And as I mentioned, Emmanuel Cochia, in his recently published book, The Life of Plants, A Metaphysics of Mixture, Cochia is a philosopher working in Paris, says, it seems that no one ever wanted to question the superiority of animal life over plant life and the rights of life and death of the former over those of the latter. A form of life without personality and without dignity, vegetal life or vegetal being, does not seem to deserve any spontaneous empathy or the exercise of a moralism that higher living beings are capable of eliciting. So here, Kocha is talking both about sort of contemporary culture, but also the history of Western intellectualism and philosophy, which in his argument has sort of just kind of taken for granted that animal life is the superior or higher form of life than plant life. As someone who has, worked a little bit on medieval philosophy, I can say that philosophers were often very concerned with distinguishing humans from animals and how had all kinds of arguments about how humans were regarded as or should be regarded as superior to animals. Plants don't even enter the equation. Oftentimes, there's just this sort of assumption that that's not even worth thinking about, or that would be kind of laughable to entertain. And the consequences of this, Kocha points out, are that we occupy this world full of these beings that we think don't deserve empathy, don't deserve consideration, don't require any kind of moral calculation from us, that we treat as just sort of exploitable stuff. These are kind of contentious arguments, but is one of the things that we are sort of discussing in this class about whether or not we think this is actually the case. And if it is, all right, how or when or why can we sort of change our thinking? All right, so that was neglect. This argument that, that Western thought really just hasn't done enough to kind of reckon with the vegetal world. Another argument, as I've indicated, is crisis, right? And not only the climate crisis, which is resulting in sort of huge changes in the environments that plants have evolved to expect, but other crises as well, crises of deforestation, of the loss of particular kinds of biomes. And species lost, right? We're living in an era of mass extinction, many scientists have argued. What you can see on the screen here, and I want to kind of move this sort of out of the way so you can see as much of it, is a detail of a painting by a contemporary visual artist, Isabella Kirkland. And what she's doing in this painting is part of a whole series of paintings that just have one-word titles, and they feature plants and animals, often small animals, usually birds, but some other animals as well, in the style of a 17th century Dutch still life. And if you know anything about sort of the art history You might know that Dutch still lifes were very, very influential style of painting, that they became popular and much requested with folks who had become wealthy in the Renaissance in the 17th century, particularly people who had become wealthy off of international trade. So Dutch merchants were amongst these folks. And they commissioned and purchased these paintings of mostly plants, flowering plants, oftentimes in exotic vases, as decorations for their home. And many of the plants that are featured in the Dutch still life paintings are actually plants that people had made money off of, right? By sort of by importing from faraway places, by trading as, I mean, the tulip was even a kind of currency in Holland at one point. And the function of these paintings is really sort of rendering these kind of living things or once living things as possessions, right? As a way, transforming a plant into a way to show off your wealth. So that's what Kirkland is kind of responding to here. And what she's done instead in this painting, Gone, as you can see a little bit of the vase that is holding this collection of flowering plants, green plants, and birds together. Um, as you might suspect, just the title alone, just this one word, gone, gives this painting a whole different kind of meaning and a story than a traditional Dutch still life does. As you can probably sort of guess or intuit, these are all species that are extinct, right? That are no longer with us. So you might recognize, if you know anything about animals, the passenger pigeon there as sort of at the top. But you probably don't recognize the plants, right? And this sort of begs questions about, when we think about what we're missing and like what we can no longer possess. Again, do plants even like enter our kind of mental calculus, right? We tend to think of animals when we think of loss of species, even if we know that lots of plants are, going extinct or, maybe extinct and may never be again. And this painting kind of flips the Dutch still life on its head by sort of saying, these are things that you can no longer possess because they're no longer here, right? And asking the viewer to think about, well, what's the history, right, behind this relationship between us, between, people like those of us who are looking at the painting and these kind of, these species that led to this, right? So crisis is a reason to look at plants. On a more positive note, another reason to talk about plants is that there is some really exciting new science being done with plants, and not only is it kind of animating botany, but popular descriptions of it are really kind of becoming sort of big with the sort of public at large. So this quote that I have here is from a very, very recent book by the journalist Zoe Schlanger. It's called The Light Eaters. And the subtitle of it is How the Unseen World of Plant Intelligence Offers a New Understanding of Life on Earth. That's a pretty big, that's a pretty big claim, or a big sort of like attention-grabbing subtitle. But as this quote points out, that it kind of reflects sort of the excitement that is being generated about some of these studies about the way in which plants communicate with one another, the way in which they respond to their worlds, the way in which they modify their worlds. Whether or not they have things like memory, what their kind of sensibilities are, how do they know what's happening around them? Um, how do those compare to animal sensibilities, or how are they just totally different? A lot of this stuff is sort of going on right now, and Schlanger documents it in her recent book. And this quote shows is from her introduction, and it's her talking about how she sort of went about interviewing people and finding out the material for what she was writing about. And she was, obviously talking to a lot of botanists, a lot of plant scientists. So she says the scientists allowed themselves to unleash their volcanic enthusiasm. They told me about the corner of the world they had just demystified, their own personal shard of the vast and chaotic puzzle of biology that they had found through sifting with the finest sieve through the sediment of the world. I think really sort of captures that kind of excitement. And it's an excitement that's leading to all kinds of discussion groups and collectives and workshops. There's one at Harvard, for example, called Thinking with Plants and Fungi. That's a sort of multidisciplinary discussion group. There's another sort of series of media called the Plant Initiative that's being sort of run out of Arizona State, but is much bigger than that. So there's a lot of intellectual energy around this topic. And I should say, just that myself, I'm a humanist. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a biologist. So, but I can talk about the way in which this research is being presented to a wider public, what it reports, how it reports it. Um, which is, I think, an important part of just talking about the process of scientific discovery and the way science is being sort of run and disseminated at the moment. Oops. Okay, when you have discovery, you also have challenges. You learn new things, and those new things may demand some kind of accommodation of your traditional ways of thinking about things, your traditional methods of talking about them. Um, and this is also sort of animating these kind of new discoveries. And it's really, as I just sort of indicated with the reading groups and the workshops, it's really energized a kind of multidisciplinary conversation about plant life. And this quote here is from I think, a really cool collection of essays titled The Language of Plants, Science, Philosophy, and Literature. It is just that. It has contributions from scientists, from philosophers, from literary critics, all sort of thinking about this question of, do plants have a language? If they do, what do we mean by language? How flexible do we want the definition of a language to be? Do we want to discriminate between language and communication? Do we want to limit language to human beings? Why, if so, why? And what do we gain or lose from that? Really, really sort of valuable questions tackled by a group of very smart people working in different ways. And so the editors of this collection, the three of them listed here, who are all from different disciplines, say in their introduction to their volume, we hope that the language of plants elicits more questions than it resolves, and thus stimulates further directions for multidisciplinary approaches to critical plant studies. the critical examination of the discourse of language, including its bias towards human expression and its presumption of verbal capacities that can inspire us to see language, plants, and ourselves in a new light, right? So again, here, I think not only do you see the sort of excitement about this kind of new work, but also about the necessity and the excitement about opportunities of discussing, like, what does this mean, right? I mean, ethically, what do these discoveries demand for us? Politically, do they deserve a kind of response in some kind of way? Philosophically and linguistically, do we have to talk about our conceptual categories for things and how they're being sort of shaken up or how they might be moved around? Um, all kinds of great stuff, great conversation can come out of this. Okay, and again, I don't know, still, hopeful but also kind of sad sort of note. That another argument that a lot of folks are making is that if we want to take care of people, we also need to take care of plants. That those two things are not separable, and that plants are necessary for our survival. Our relationship to them is absolutely crucial. Um, and this, I think, is sort of captured in this terrific book by the anthropologist Anna Lowenhout Singh, The Mushroom at the End of the World, in which she focuses on the Matsutake mushroom and all the kind of human communities that have formed around gathering this mushroom, selling this mushroom, processing it, consuming it, shipping it. She's an anthropologist, so she sort of looks at the ways in which various groups of people sort of respond to this. Okay, it's not a form of plant life. Plant-like life, close enough. I think fungi sort of occupy the same kind of conceptual space oftentimes as plants do. But how they all relate, right, to this kind of vegetal life, if you will say that. And she begins this book on a note of sort of personal reflection, where she says, "What do you do when your world starts to fall apart? I go for a walk, and if I'm really lucky, I find mushrooms." And then she sort of moves into out to this kind of bigger sort of societal perspective, by noting this sort of really startling fact. When Hiroshima was destroyed by an atomic bomb in 1945, it is said the first living thing to emerge from the blasted landscape was a matsutake mushroom. Um, that sets up, I think, this whole sort of very complicated discussion about the way in which our human lives are dependent upon, in so many ways, non-human ones, right? And that our survival, our hope for our survival, is kind of linked to them. And related to that, plants have in the West, well, and also elsewhere in the world, for a long time been a primary source of medicine. The first kind of descriptions or sort of really um, uh, significant scientific works about plants were encyclopedias and herbals. We're going to look at some herbals in the course. Herbals are essentially recipes or sort of collections of recipes for medicines based on a single plant. So they will list a plant and then list all the medicines that can be made from them. And we are going to talk about plants' role in healing, both as this sort of consumed sort of resources, but also possibly as providing healing environments, healing companionship, healing relationships, in a number of ways. And one of the sort of one of the films that we will be looking at the course is a film from 2018 called Leave No Trace. And there's a still from it here. The film follows the sort of the adventures, if you'll say that, or sort of the lives of a war veteran with severe PTSD and his daughter, who deliberately live in green spaces in sort of public parks or kind of wooded areas near cities as a kind of refuge away from the built environment that humans have, that we've created. And one of the really sort of terrific things about the film is that it invites us to kind of see and feel through the body of this veteran who sensitivities have been activated and is kind of attuned to green worlds in ways that many of us are sort of oblivious to. Yeah, the film raises sort of interesting questions about how plants and green worlds can be a home for us, and why they're often not. That's another kind of reason to think about plants, and also an aspect of the course. Okay, so I've talked about why plants now. As I've said, I'm not a biologist. You might be thinking, well, why wouldn't I just take it? Why wouldn't I just take a bio course? Why wouldn't I study botany? Why all this other stuff? I mean, why not find out about plants through the science on plants? Um, I think hopefully some of what I've said has given you a sort of idea of why it's important to talk about the cultural ways in which we think about plants, in which we talk about plants, in which we experience plants. Perhaps I might illustrate that just a little bit further with just a quick kind of anecdote about what drew me in particular to this field. Um, as I said, I'm a medievalist. I was already interested in the history of human thinking about the natural world and the history of perceptions of the natural world. And in 2013, I read an article by the journalist Michael Pollan, who is a well-known journalist, has written a lot on food, sort of in particular the kind of modern American sort of food system, but also plants more generally. His recent work is on sort of plants and psychoactive experience, and the research that's being done on that. I have here showing you a really terrific book that I first read by him called The Botany of Desire, in which instead of asking the question, how have we used plants, he sort of flips it on its head, and considers, well, how have plants used us? Like, what if we make them the protagonists of the story, and flip the roles? And he focuses on four species of plants. I believe it's, if I can remember, the apple, corn, the potato, and marijuana, to talk about the way in which these particular species of plants or kinds of plants have used us to thrive, right? Have spread way beyond what their kind of domains would have been without our sort of assistance, or without the ability to kind of travel through us. So I was already a fan of that. In the article for the New Yorker, Pollan was talking about the new plant science that I mentioned, this research in which people were kind of raising anew these questions of like, well, can we say that plants have a language? I mean, can we say that they sense things? Can we say that they're intelligent in some kind of way? That, I mean, even if it's like, that they don't have a mind that's anything like ours. Might there not might we not consider might we want not consider what a plant mind can be? So Pollen was sort of talking about the science, and he was also talking about how at that time it was very, very controversial, right? So some people were really enthusiastic about this new science. Other people were people who particularly, he said, biologists who've been trained as kind of, in molecular biology and cellular biology were really kind of hesitant to sort of go down this route. So I read this article. I was fascinated by it, and then in the next issue, the New Yorker always prints articles to the letters to the editor that respond to the article. Sure enough, a molecular biologist had written in a very angry letter, and he said, you can't say that plants are intelligent. There's nothing, plants don't have a nervous system, and you need a nervous system, to have any kind of mind, and saying that plants have a mind, that's just a metaphor. And of course, the phrase like just a metaphor for like a person who works with language, that was like gold. So I was like, wow, what does it mean to be just a metaphor? And my immediate reaction was, well, we might think of metaphors as sort of like artistic, poetic devices, but really, figurative language, of which metaphor is a kind, is everywhere in speech, right? We would have a hard time communicating without figures of speech. We're so used to them we don't even notice them half the time. So, like in this sentence, when I heard the crash, I dropped everything and flew to her side. Flew, I'm obviously not flying, but flew has now sort of acquired this kind of new definition, right? Because of its metaphorical use. Same thing with dropped, right? I mean, I guess you could read this as I literally dropped everything, but that's probably wouldn't be how it's intended. And, again, figurative language sort of slides into what we actually consider the definition of language to be. And it's a kind of modern, a very recent historical development that we have this idea that science should be written in this kind of unambiguous, pure language that is only literal and exactly matches the thing it describes and doesn't have any kind of figures of speech or rhetoric to it. Um, for most of history, this is not the way people thought. I mean, medieval people thought if you're going to talk about a sophisticated subject like science, you need sophisticated language. And oftentimes that's poetic language. Um, so this really kind of like got me into thinking about, this question of, whether or not plants have worlds, whether or not they have selves or minds or feelings or whatever you want to say. It's not just a question of cellular structure. It's not just a question of genetics. It's not just a question of morphology. It's a question of language, right? It's a question of how we use language, what we want terms to mean, how generous we are with them, how stingy we want to be with them. Yeah, how we choose to sort of chop up the world with our words, more or less. Um, all right, so moving back to just sort of thinking about the class as a whole, I don't have a clock, so I'm having a hard time keeping track of time. Um, some questions that are going to come up. I mean, first and obvious that isn't on here is sort of, what is a green world? What is a oops? What does it mean to have a world? Can plants be said to have a world? And sort of attendant on this, these related questions. What's it like to be a plant? Might we say they have feelings in some kind of way? Is there a way we can know? Perhaps we can never know, but is there a way we can find out? Um, what do we owe the plant life that we occupy the world with? Does it change? Do our obligations change if we think that they are selves, right? If they have feelings, or if they can think, or if they are responsive, or if they have language, does that impact the way we interact with plants at all? And if so, how? All right, and as you can perhaps sort of, sense, since I'm a medievalist, oops, sorry, we are looking at materials from antiquity, from the Greek world. Actually, we're starting, the earliest thing I think we're doing is Aristotle's On the Soul, which sort of divides things up, things in the world into categories of being. All the way up through contemporary science fiction and art. So things that were produced quite recently. Here you've got a little picture of a medieval mandrake, a sort of plant human hybrid. And on the other side, you have a very recent kind of Instagram famous, I think, image by the Japanese artist Raku Inoue, giving another kind of green person, sort of imagining, right, what would happen if you took this kind of quintessentially modern human scenario with someone at his computer and it rendered it as planty in some way, right? And I think one of the delights about doing a big historical survey like this is the opportunity to juxtapose ancient and modern images. Okay, this is as much as I can make it. It is a multidisciplinary class. We are reading literature, that's my home discipline, but we're also reading works of philosophy. We're reading some discussions of science. We will be looking at films and art, and also a little bit of landscape design and built environments. For literature, we will be starting with Ovid's, the Latin writer, Ovid's sort of tour de force of retold ancient mythology with his work Metamorphosis, which features humans who turn into other things, amongst them plants. We'll be continuing with the medieval Arthurian romance Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which features this planty person who, is he a human? Is he a plant? Who challenges the Arthurian court. Moving on to Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream. We have an image here of an actor playing Puck. There are lots of planty characters, and plants play a sort of important but often overlooked role in this drama that was performed in a wooden theater outside, right, where the theater sort of reminds people of being in that kind of forest. Later, we will look at Charles Chestnut's short story, The Goop-Haired Grapevine, which thinks about the American plantation economy and its impact on the relationship between Black, white communities and the farmed plants that grow in these estates. We will consider the science fiction and fantasy writer Ursula Le Guin's short story, Vaster Than Empires, which experiments with a totally green world visited by humans, and who's find that their cultural assumptions are greatly challenged by this kind of vegetal other. And finally, we'll be reading Jeff Vandermeer's recent science work of science fiction, Annihilation, which also speculates about the interaction, the sort of, you know, interaction between human and plants, and and ways of representing those two entities as kind of continuous. So I think these are all really, really enjoyable works, and so I hope you would like them. For philosophy and criticism, as I mentioned, we're starting out with Aristotle, his consideration of on the soul, as in who has one, who doesn't, what kind of soul do different forms of life have, what difference does that make? Um, my class just finished today talking about some excerpts from Coach's Life of Plants and Michael Marter's Through Vegetal Being, two contemporary philosophers that are publishing now on these questions of you know, how can philosophy sort of reckon, or intellectual culture reckon, with the life of plants. Another such work is Jeffrey Nealon's Plant Theory. We will later in the semester be reading some of the immensely popular and also terrifically provocative, I think, work Braiding Sweetgrass by the indigenous botanist Robin Wall Kimmerer, looking at another indigenous writer's work, Prudence Gibson's The Plant Thieves. She is a member of First Nations in Australia. She talks about the history of plant collection as part of a colonial enterprise. And also thinking, turning to the cultural critic Kate Sandilands' essay on vegetate, and you know, how we use that word, how we use that concept, what it means for our relationship to plants. Okay, for science, we are doing a little bit of history of science. We're going to be looking at the first encyclopedia really in the West, Pliny's Natural History. We will be looking at herbals and bestiaries, which are other ways of communicating information about plants in the pre-modern era. We'll be looking at a work on the work of the herbarium of plant collection, and we'll be talking about the new plant science from the account of it in Zoe Slanger's The Light Eaters. Also, sort of in the scientific vein, we're going to visit the WVU herbarium, which is a fascinating place and a really interesting resource that a lot of people on campus don't know about. I've worked with the director, Donna Ford Wirtz, and I think this should be really interesting. The other thing that we will be doing is going to the rare book room of the library and looking at their collection of botanical publications, which include herbals from the 16th century, early printed books, a copy, a 17th century copy of Robert Hooke's Micrographia, which was the first work to record the observations of someone using a microscope to look at plant structures. There is a sort of a first edition of Linnaeus's work on plants, which led to the Linnaean system, the whole sort of taxonomy that biologists use today. There is lots and lots of really good stuff in the rare books collection, and we'll get to see some of it. We are also looking at art and film. Showed you a few images today. We will be looking at the contemporary artist Laurie Palmer's work, The Lichen Museum. Some artistic explorations by scientists working on plant structures called microcosms. We will be reading well, it's kind of a graphic novel. It's really a collection of published comics by Alan Moore of DC Comics, The Swamp Thing. And we'll be delving into a little plant horror with the 1978 film Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which imagines this sort of scenario in which alien plants have taken over human bodies. And then we'll also be looking at Leave No Trace, which I have already talked about. And finally, we'll do a little bit of thinking about landscape design too. We'll be looking at Robert Harrison's book, Gardens, an essay on the human condition, specifically his chapter on the gardens of the homeless, which you may not think exist, but they do. And then we'll also be reading from the art historian and art critic Giovanni Alloy's book, Lawn, on the lawn as a kind of cultural phenomena. Okay, looking at all this stuff, we're going to do a number of things. We're obviously reading historical works of fiction, poetry, and philosophy featuring plant life. We're analyzing their texts and their illustrations with respect to their rhetorical strategies, their style, their cultural context, which I will be supplying, talking about. We will discuss the ethical and cultural dimensions of human-plant relations. You will be creating some written and visual aids in curating, encouraging botanic awareness. You'll be thinking about how you, as a writer, artist, producer of creative work, might get people interested in plants. And we'll also be doing at the end of the semester, planning a kind of collective exhibit of materials for the course, thinking about how you would present what we've learned and what we've found out and what we've discovered to a wider audience in a kind of public-facing exhibit. We're not going to be able to actually stage the public-facing exhibit. That's a little too ambitious for the time we have, but we will at least be able to think about how you would do it and to draw up some plans for it. And I want to also sort of reassure people too, you do not need to be an accomplished artist to do the visual material in the course. And you do not need to be an accomplished creative writer to do the kind of creative writing that we're going to do too. Right. And here's a kind of breakdown of the work for the course. Class discussion is really, really important. It's sort of ironic that I'm lecturing you today because I try not to do this in class. I try and do as little of it as possible. Most of class is class discussion of readings that I'm trying to keep relatively doable, the readings. To help you work your way through the readings and also prepare for class discussion, I'm asking people to keep a handwritten notebook of responses to the readings, which we'll meet and talk about in an office hours visit. There will be an analytic essay on one of the texts for the class. But there will also be a creative work, so an opportunity for you to work with either sort of creative writing or some sort of visual or even tactile or other sort of media. And then the exhibit curation that I talked about. All right, I think I'm probably at time, and yeah,
Yeah.
and that should be it.
Yep. Time. So if you want to end your share and
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. That's a good idea.
students, we want to open up the floor for questions. We got about 6 minutes. I think there's one in there that asks, and I can read it to you. Would you suggest this course for any wildlife, fishery, forest, or soil science major in the honors college? Will it have any pre or co-requisites?
Yes, I would suggest it for you. I think it will be a different kind of approach to maybe some of the subjects that you've already sort of explored in your major. There are no prerequisites for this course. And I should say that, we are working with material from a number of different disciplines. I don't expect that everybody is going to be an expert equally in, philosophy, literature, botany, anthropology, all the other sort of things that we're drawing from. We're sort of going to pool our collective wisdom, and the more people from as many different majors as possible would be great. Yeah, but you don't you there are no prerequisites for the class.
Okay, thank you. What other questions would we have for Dr. Farina in that very interesting presentation? You can put it in the Q&A. I really like your interdisciplinary approach.
Thank
It's
you. Thank
interesting.
you.
Does this course cover invasive plants?
We are going to talk a little bit about invasive plants, particularly when we get to the kind of plant horror unit. Um, yeah, and we will have a kind of conversation about what are the things that freak people out about plants, right? Why have people been afraid of plants in past? What have plants signified to them? Why should we maybe be afraid of some plants now? Maybe we should not be. So yeah, we will touch upon that a little bit. And one of the authors one of the authors that we're reading, Kate Sandilands, has written on this subject. We're reading a slightly different piece of hers, but yeah, but it will come up.
Do you ever attack how plants are used in holistic approaches, such as how musicians picture flowers or light to create an emotion through their playing?
Yeah, we are. I mean, so this is a sort of course about, in part the cultural representation of plants. So yeah, we are definitely thinking about how artists, writers, I don't have any music in the course, but I would welcome someone who wants to talk about that and might think about that as a kind of creative project for the class. So yeah, we will talk about that.
Okay, we got a couple minutes left here. Do you personally think plants can communicate to one another?
I I am I will say that I have read the reading I've done of the kind of new science of plant communication suggests to me that there is a kind of consensus that plants use chemical signaling to communicate, right? That is that's not that much in doubt right now. I mean, there's also been a lot of work done on the way in which plants communicate with one another through roots and through soil structure, especially kind of in partnership with fungi. And yeah, I mean, again, not a biologist. I don't have the sort of chops to kind of, run a test on those things myself, but my understanding from reading discussions of the science is this is a becoming a fairly well accepted idea. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, final question here. It's a two-part. It's like two, I think students who are in some majors are interested. So I have a student who asks, would you recommend this for an environmental and civil engineering major? And then someone who is a landscape architect major.
Yes, I think landscape architect major, this should actually, I think, be particularly interesting to you. We are going to do a little a little bit of thinking about designed environments. I would like to have Judith Wasserman, who is a professor in the landscape architecture department, come and talk to the class a little bit about that. And for an environmental and civil engineering major, yeah, again, I think so. It's going to be different than the kind of stuff that are normally doing. But one thing I could just say from sort of personal experience is I have kind of witnessed what happens when engineers don't take public feelings about plants into consideration with sort of the Morgantown utility boards, um, what they've done with White Park, which sort of, they went in and kind of were like, well, engineering solves the problem this way. But they hadn't really anticipated a kind of public backlash. And so I think for an engineering major, it might actually give you a sense of like, right, who are engineers in conversation with, right, when it comes to manipulating the environment.
All righty. And the final question, I'm just going to answer it. Someone asks if this is a GEF course. It's a GEF 5. So, Lara, I want to thank you very much for your time. We appreciate the opportunity to spend this time with you. Students, if you have any further questions, you can reach out to Dr. Farina at lara.farina@mail.wvu.edu. An archived version of this webinar will be available later on the Honors College website. Thank you for spending this time with us, students. You'll have a good rest of the evening. And Lara, thank you very much for your excellent presentation and talking about your course. Really appreciate
Great,
your time.
thank you. I'm sorry I went over time.
No, you're good. You are
Long.
good. We are fine. We are totally fine.
Okay. All right.
Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye.